The sun, a pale coin in a sky the color of old tin, cast long, brittle shadows across the dusty main street of Harmony Gulch. Winter had settled in deep, gnawing at the very bones of the structures and the spirit of the men and women huddled against its relentless chill. Inside the communal hall, where the annual Christmas charity auction was underway, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool, wood smoke, and a faint underlying current of unease. Ming stood quietly by her basket, a woven offering wrapped in a humble, worn linen cloth, her hands clasped tightly before her. Her gray prairie dress, mended countless times, seemed to absorb what little light dared to fall upon her, making her a study in quiet resilience amidst the boisterous, self-congratulatory din. The rough-hewn floorboards beneath her boots thrummed with the movement of townsfolk, their faces flushed with cider and a false warmth that did not extend to her. She watched as other baskets, laden with pies and preserves, quilts and other handcrafted items, found eager bidders, their owners beaming with the satisfaction of a good deed recognized. Each clap of a hand, each bellowed price, was a tiny, sharp jab, a reminder of her solitary existence on the fringes of this community. A heavy silence followed the auctioneer's call for her offering, a quiet so profound it swallowed the usual murmurs and whispers. The auctioneer, a corpulent man named Silas, cleared his throat, his gaze skittering past Ming as if she were a ghost haunting the edges of the room. "Next up, folks, we have a basket from... well, it's a basket." His voice trailed off, laden with an unspoken dismissal that echoed loudly in the sudden void. Ming felt the familiar flush creep up her neck, a heat that had nothing to do with the roaring fire in the hearth. She had poured days into her basket, selecting the finest herbs from her small, painstakingly tended garden, grinding them into fragrant, potent teas, and baking a dense, spiced bread that spoke of her homeland's culinary traditions. It was a piece of herself, carefully offered, a bridge she hoped might finally reach across the vast chasm of their indifference. But no one so much as shifted their weight towards her. No one met her gaze. The silence stretched, becoming a visible thing, heavy and suffocating. It was not merely the absence of bids, it was the absence of recognition, of connection, of any human warmth directed her way. Her chest tightened, a familiar ache blooming just beneath her ribs. This was the ritual of her existence here, to offer and to be quietly, pointedly refused. The weight of countless such rejections pressed down on her, bending her shoulders just a fraction more, but never quite breaking her spirit. She was an outsider, always and forever, a solitary figure against the relentless tide of their collective disdain. Yet she stood, unmoving, unwilling to retreat entirely from this arena of quiet cruelty. The thought of simply walking away, taking her unwanted offering and melting back into the lonely anonymity of her small cabin on the outskirts of town was a powerful lure, but a stubborn resolve, forged in years of hardship, kept her rooted to the spot, awaiting the final, inevitable pronouncement of her worthlessness in their eyes. She would not grant them the satisfaction of seeing her flee, not entirely, not yet. The humiliation was a bitter draught, but she had learned to swallow it with a quiet dignity that was all her own. The collective exhale in the hall was almost palpable as Silas, with a dismissive shrug, moved on to the next item, a hand-knitted shawl from Mrs. Henderson that immediately drew a flurry of eager bids. Ming remained, a silent sentinel, her basket still untouched, a monument to their communal turning away. The vibrant energy of the auction flowed around her, a river of voices and laughter that meticulously avoided her small eddy of solitude. She could feel the stares, the sidelong glances, the whispers that followed her presence like shadows. They were not malicious in their intensity, but rather cold and curious, a distant appraisal of an anomaly they couldn't quite reconcile with their tidy world. Her eyes, however, were not fixed on the fleeting spectacle of the auction, but rather on the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light filtering through the high windows, each particle a tiny, fleeting world unto itself, much like her own isolated existence. It was in this moment of profound, quiet resignation that the heavy door at the back of the hall creaked open, admitting a fresh gust of frigid air and a new presence. Joshua stepped inside, shaking a fine dusting of snow from the brim of his wide-brimmed hat. He was a man built for the vast, unforgiving expanses of the land, lean and solid, his movements deliberate, unhurried. His sheepskin coat, weathered and marked by countless seasons, draped his broad shoulders, and his eyes, a startling clear blue, seemed to take in the entire room with a single, unblinking sweep. He didn't carry the usual jovial air of the townsfolk, nor the hurried anxiety of those seeking a bargain. There was a stillness about him, a grounded quality that set him apart, even from the other ranchers who frequented these gatherings. As the hubbub of the auction continued, momentarily unbroken by his entrance, Joshua moved with a quiet purpose towards the back, his gaze eventually settling upon Ming. He saw her, truly saw her, not as an extension of some whispered rumor or a curiosity to be ignored, but as a woman standing alone, her head held high despite the unspoken affront. He saw the gray prairie dress, its humble fabric speaking volumes of a life lived with careful frugality, and the basket, sitting forlornly, conspicuously ignored. A faint furrow appeared between his brows, a silent question in the depth of his gaze. He hadn't come for the auction, not really. He usually sent his foreman for supplies, preferring the quiet solitude of his ranch to the crowded, often boisterous confines of town gatherings. But today, a minor repair to a wagon wheel had necessitated his personal journey, a journey that had led him, unexpectedly, into this tableau of quiet desperation and collective indifference. He watched, his hands tucked into his pockets, as another basket was sold for a robust sum, the cheerful calls of the auctioneer resounding through the hall. Then his eyes returned to Ming, to the still, unwavering set of her shoulders, to the careful, almost invisible clench of her jaw. There was a story in her posture, a narrative of enduring hardship, and an unyielding spirit that resonated with something deep within him, a silent understanding that transcended the chasm of their different worlds. He saw not the Chinese widow that the whispers had conjured, but simply a person, stripped bare by the cold indifference of others, yet stubbornly refusing to crumble. He lingered for a moment, an uncommon quiet observer in a room full of people too eager to look away, the silent witness to a quiet, profound injustice playing out beneath the festive boughs of mistletoe and pine. The air around Ming seemed to crackle with an unspoken tension, a fragile vessel holding all her hopes and her quiet despair. Silas, having successfully offloaded a set of poorly crafted wooden spoons, finally circled back to the single, forlorn item still unclaimed. He caught Joshua's eye briefly, a flicker of surprise in the auctioneer's expression before he forced a strained smile. "And last but certainly not least," Silas announced, his voice lacking its earlier gusto, "we still have this unique offering. Any bids? For the herbal teas and baked goods." He didn't specify the owner, didn't need to. Everyone knew. The silence that followed was even more deafening than before, laced now with an uncomfortable tension, as if the entire room collectively held its breath, waiting for the inevitable, final dismissal. Ming felt a familiar cold dread seep into her bones, anticipating the curt wave of the hand, the final, public declaration that her small offering, and by extension she herself, was utterly without value. Her gaze was fixed on a knot in the rough wood of the floor, tracing its intricate patterns, anything to avoid meeting the pitying or disdainful eyes of the assembled townsfolk. Her heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, each beat a painful thud against the wall of her quiet resilience. She had expected this, had prepared herself for this, yet the sting of it was no less potent, the humiliation no less sharp. It was a familiar wound, reopening with each passing year, each hopeful offering met with the same chilling silence. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, a weariness that went beyond the physical demands of her meager life, reaching into the very core of her spirit. Just as Silas was about to bring down his gavel, to finally put an end to her prolonged agony, a clear, steady voice cut through the heavy silence. $5. The words, simple and unadorned, landed in the room with the force of a thunderclap. Every head swiveled, every eye fixed on Joshua, who stood near the back, his gaze steady, unwavering, directed not at Silas, but at Ming. The sheer audacity of it, to bid on that basket and for such a sum, seemed to momentarily stun the crowd into absolute stillness. $5 was a respectable price for even the most coveted of baskets, a generous sum that spoke of true intention, not a charitable pittance. Ming slowly lifted her head, her own eyes, wide with disbelief, finally meeting Joshua's. There was no pity there, no condescension, only a quiet resolve that seemed to cut through the oppressive atmosphere of the hall. He hadn't looked away, hadn't flinched from the collective disapproval that now seemed to settle, not on her, but on him. Silas, visibly flustered, stammered, $5 for this basket?" His gaze flickered between Joshua's unwavering stare and Ming's stunned face. The question hung in the air, a challenge and an indictment all at once. Joshua simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, but one that held the weight of an unshakable conviction. "Yes, $5. His voice was low, yet it carried clearly, resonating with a quiet authority that brooked no argument. Ming felt a sudden, inexplicable warmth bloom in her chest, chasing away some of the debilitating cold. It was a strange, foreign sensation, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Her basket, containing the carefully dried ginseng, the pungent star anise, the finely ground ginger, and the small, intricately braided loaf of her special sweet potato bread, suddenly seemed to glow with a quiet, undeniable significance. It wasn't just a collection of ingredients, it was an extension of her very being, her heritage, her enduring spirit. And now, someone, this quiet rancher with the steady eyes, had seen its worth, had affirmed it against the tide of all those who had refused to even acknowledge its existence. The moment stretched, taut with unspoken emotion, a fragile bridge forming across the chasm of expectation and prejudice, anchored by a simple, profound act of quiet defiance. Silas, after a moment of stunned silence, finally found his voice, though it was a little thin. $5. Going once? Going twice? Sold to the rancher for $5. The gavel fell with a decisive thud that echoed unexpectedly loud in the suddenly hushed hall. It wasn't the usual celebratory sound of a successful bid. It was more like a punctuation mark on an event that had defied all expectation. A murmur swept through the room, a low hum of curiosity and thinly veiled judgment, directed now with equal intensity at both Ming and Joshua. But the rancher paid them no mind. He walked forward, his steps unhurried, his focus entirely on Ming. She watched him approach, her breath catching in her throat, a strange mixture of apprehension and a nascent, unfamiliar warmth swirling within her. As he reached her, he extended a calloused hand, holding out a crisp $5 bill. The paper was worn, softened by countless exchanges, yet in her eyes it shone with a radiant, almost holy light. It was more than currency. It was a tangible acknowledgment, a proof of worth where only dismissal had existed moments before. Her fingers, still trembling slightly, reached out and gently took the bill. The brief brush of their skin sent a surprising jolt through her, a fleeting connection that felt profound in its unexpectedness. Their eyes met again, and in that shared glance, a silent conversation unfolded. She saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps even compassion, in his deep blue gaze, and she hoped he saw her gratitude, her quiet surprise, the fragile blossoming of something akin to relief in her own. Her throat felt tight, a knot of emotion preventing any words from forming. She wanted to thank him, to articulate the depth of what his simple act had meant, but the words were caught, choked by years of unspoken loneliness and the sudden, overwhelming sensation of being seen. Joshua, sensing her struggle, offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you for the basket," he said, his voice low and even, a quiet murmur that was just for her ears amidst the surrounding buzz. "It looks good." He paused, his gaze resting for a moment on the humble, woven container, now filled with an unexpected significance. He didn't elaborate, didn't feel the need to justify his actions to her or to the onlookers. His words were simple, sincere, and entirely without pretension, a stark contrast to the performative charity of the other townsfolk. Ming managed a small, hesitant nod in return, a silent affirmation of her acceptance. She watched as he carefully picked up the basket, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he took hold of the handles. He turned and began to walk towards the exit, the $5 bill clutched tightly in Ming's hand, its edges almost digging into her palm. The weight of it was substantial, a physical anchor in a world that had felt adrift moments before. As Joshua disappeared through the heavy door, a wave of cold air washing into the hall in his wake, Ming was left standing alone once more. But this time, the solitude felt different. It was no longer the crushing weight of public rejection, but a quiet, contemplative space, filled with the echo of his footsteps and the lingering sensation of his presence. The townspeople began to resume their chatter, their voices slowly rising in volume as they processed the unusual event. Some stared at Ming, a new kind of curiosity in their eyes, tinged perhaps with a touch of discomfort or even belated respect. Others whispered amongst themselves, no doubt dissecting Joshua's inexplicable act. But Ming barely registered them. Her attention was drawn inward, to the small, warm ember that had been kindled in her heart, a spark that had been absent for so long, now flickering with a tentative, fragile light. The cold outside still beckoned. The long walk home awaited, but the path ahead somehow seemed a little less bleak, a little less desolate, illuminated by the unexpected glimmer of a solitary, silent kindness. The frigid air outside the hall bit at Ming's exposed cheeks, but she barely felt it, still cradling the $5 bill as if it were a delicate, living thing. Each step she took away from the bustling, gossiping crowd seemed to lighten the invisible burden she had carried for so long, though the weight of the day's events still pressed heavily upon her. The setting sun painted the western sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, a dramatic backdrop to her quiet, solitary journey home. She walked along the snow-dusted path, the familiar crunch of her boots on the frozen earth providing the only soundtrack to her swirling thoughts. The image of Joshua, his steady eyes, his quiet, unyielding presence, replayed in her mind like a scene from a dream. He hadn't bought her basket out of pity, she was certain of it. There was a dignity in his gesture, a profound respect that she hadn't encountered from anyone in Harmony Gulch since her arrival, not since her husband had passed, leaving her alone in a land that seemed to reject her at every turn. Her thoughts drifted back to the basket itself, its simple contents now imbued with a new significance. The dried herbs, painstakingly gathered and prepared, the special bread, a recipe passed down through generations. These were the tangible expressions of her resilience, her quiet determination to not only survive, but to retain a piece of her heritage, her very soul, in a world that demanded conformity. And he, the quiet rancher, had somehow seen beyond the surface, recognized the unspoken stories woven into the fabric of her offering. He had paid for something more than just ingredients. He had paid for her dignity, for her worth, for a fleeting moment of human connection that transcended the harsh realities of prejudice and isolation. The $5 in her hand felt substantial, a true windfall that would allow her to buy precious provisions, lamp oil, a small sack of flour, perhaps even a few new seeds for her spring garden. But more than the material benefit, it was the feeling it represented, the feeling of being acknowledged, that truly nourished her. It was a lifeline thrown into a sea of loneliness, an unexpected kindness that whispered of possibility. As she approached her small, isolated cabin, a wisp of smoke curling lazily from its chimney, a sense of cautious hope began to unfurl within her. The cabin, usually a sanctuary from the town's indifference, often felt like a prison of solitude. Tonight, however, it seemed to offer a different kind of refuge, a place where she could finally unpack this strange, beautiful gift of unexpected humanity. Back in Harmony Gulch, the gossip mills were churning with unusual vigor. Inside the general store, Mrs. Henderson, still flushed from the success of her shawl, leaned conspiratorially towards Mrs. Gable. "Did you ever see such a thing?" she whispered, her voice barely contained. $5 for that basket! And him, the rancher, a quiet man, never one for such displays. Mrs. Gable nodded sagely. "Always kept to himself, Joshua does. But to pay such a price for her basket. It does make one wonder, doesn't it?" The townsfolk, accustomed to their own unspoken hierarchy and prejudices, struggled to reconcile Joshua's actions with their established understanding of the world. It was an anomaly, a disruption to their comfortable narratives, and they picked at it like a bothersome burr. Some dismissed it as a momentary lapse of judgment, an eccentric display from an already solitary man. Others, however, felt a faint, unsettling prick of conscience, a quiet challenge to their own collective indifference. The incident would ripple through Harmony Gulch for days, shifting perceptions, however subtly. For Ming, alone in her cabin, the flicker of hope grew into a small, steady flame. She lit a single candle, its soft glow illuminating the rough-hewn walls. The $5 bill lay on her small wooden table, a silent testament to a kindness that had reached across the chasm, leaving her with a sense of connection, a thread of belonging she hadn't known she desperately craved, and a quiet, profound anticipation of what the dawning new year might bring. The winter deepened, its grip tightening on Harmony Gulch, turning the world into a stark landscape of white and gray. For Ming, however, a subtle shift had occurred, a warmth kindled by the single act of kindness at the Christmas auction. The $5 bill, carefully folded and tucked into a small embroidered pouch she kept close, was a constant, tangible reminder of Joshua's gesture. It wasn't merely the money. It was the validation it represented, a quiet affirmation that her existence, her offerings, held value in a world that had so long denied it. She found herself walking with a little more purpose, her gaze lifting from the snow-covered ground a fraction higher, meeting the glances of townsfolk with a newfound, subtle defiance rather than immediate retreat. The whispers still followed her, of course, but now they seemed to carry a different resonance, tinged with a bewildered curiosity about the rancher's peculiar action. The incident at the auction had become a quiet legend, a story passed around the pot-bellied stove at the general store, dissected and re-examined, trying to find a logical explanation for an act that defied their ingrained prejudices. For Ming, the most significant change was an internal one. The crushing weight of loneliness, a constant companion since she had arrived in this unforgiving land, felt a little lighter. Her daily routines, once undertaken with a quiet, weary resignation, now held a faint glimmer of anticipation. She still tended her small garden, even under its blanket of snow, mentally planning for spring, her hands brushing over the frozen earth with a renewed sense of connection. One crisp, late afternoon, as she made her way back from the communal well, her wooden buckets heavy with icy water, she saw him. Joshua, astride his horse, a sturdy bay with a thick winter coat, was slowly riding through the outskirts of town, heading towards the open plains beyond. He was alone, as always, a solitary figure against the vast, pale sky. Their paths converged near the edge of a snow-laden copse of pines. He reined in his horse, the animal's breath pluming in the cold air. Ming stopped, her buckets resting heavy against her sides, the icy water sloshing faintly. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken meaning, a quiet language passing between two souls accustomed to solitude. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a depth she found both unsettling and strangely comforting. There was no awkwardness in his gaze, no judgment, only a steady, unhurried presence. "Good day, Ming," he said, his voice a low rumble, carrying clearly on the crisp air. It was the first time she had heard him speak her name, and it felt like a small, precious gift, a bridge built between them. She managed a small, hesitant smile, the muscles in her face unaccustomed to the expression. "Good day, Joshua," she replied, her voice soft, a little breathless. She longed to say more, to express the gratitude that swelled in her heart, but the words still eluded her, caught somewhere between her profound emotion and her years of guarded silence. He nodded, a slight inclination of his head. "The teas, they were good," he offered, his gaze unwavering. "And the bread. My cook hasn't been able to make anything quite like it." A genuine smile, fleeting but undeniably present, touched the corners of his lips. It was a simple compliment, yet to Ming it felt like the highest praise, a testament to the effort and heart she had poured into her offering. The acknowledgment brought a fresh wave of warmth, a quiet satisfaction that settled deep within her. He didn't linger, merely offered another small nod, a gesture of quiet respect, before gently urging his horse forward, disappearing into the vast, snowy landscape. Ming watched him go, a single plume of white rising from his horse's nostrils, until he was just a distant silhouette. The water in her buckets felt lighter now, her steps imbued with a newfound lightness. The cold still bit, but the warmth within her seemed to ward it off, a small, resilient flame in the face of the encroaching winter, radiating an unexpected, quiet joy. The encounter, brief and understated as it was, had deepened the connection, weaving a thread of quiet understanding between them, a fragile yet potent bond in the desolate beauty of the winter land. The short, unassuming exchange between Ming and Joshua became a silent cornerstone in the fabric of her life. From that day forward, their paths seemed to cross with a quiet regularity, not by prearrangement, but by the unpredictable currents of their separate lives in the sprawling, sparsely populated land. Sometimes it was a brief nod as he rode past her small cabin on his way to inspect his fences on the distant rangeland, a silent acknowledgment that spoke volumes. Other times it was a more substantial, though still understated encounter in Harmony Gulch, perhaps outside the general store, where a few polite words about the weather or the health of his herd would be exchanged, always conducted with a quiet dignity that seemed to carve out a space of respect around them, impervious to the stares and whispers of the townsfolk. The community, always attuned to the subtle shifts in their social landscape, noticed these encounters. The initial bewilderment over Joshua's auction bid slowly morphed into a simmering undercurrent of speculation, and in some quarters, thinly veiled disapproval. Mrs. Henderson, her face usually a map of cheerful gossip, now wore a perpetual look of mild consternation whenever Ming and Joshua were seen in proximity. "It's simply not proper," she'd confide to Mrs. Gable, her voice hushed but firm. "A man of his standing, and her." The unspoken "her" carried the weight of all their collective prejudices and xenophobia. Yet Joshua seemed utterly oblivious to their judgment, or perhaps simply unconcerned by it. He carried himself with an innate authority, a man deeply rooted in the land, whose values were forged by the harsh realities of nature rather than the fickle opinions of a small town. His quiet strength was a shield, protecting Ming, inadvertently perhaps, from the harsher barbs of their disapproval. Ming, for her part, found an unexpected fortitude in these interactions. The fear that had once shadowed her every step began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of quiet confidence. She started to see herself not as an alien presence, but as a woman recognized, acknowledged, and even, in a profound, unspoken way, defended. The quiet acts of kindness from Joshua had awakened something within her, a dormant resilience that now began to unfurl its petals. She even began to take small, deliberate steps to bridge the gap between herself and a few of the more receptive townsfolk, offering small bunches of dried herbs from her garden, or sharing a carefully baked loaf of her spiced bread, always with a quiet, unassuming grace. These gestures were met with varying degrees of acceptance, some still hesitant, others tentatively welcoming, but it was a beginning, a fragile crack in the wall of their collective indifference. One blustery spring day, as the snow retreated in muddy rivulets and the first brave green shoots pushed through the thawing earth, Ming was tending her small plot of land when Joshua rode up, dismounting with his usual measured movements. He held a small, intricately carved wooden box in his hand, something she had never seen before. He offered it to her, his gaze steady. "I found these," he said, his voice low. "Thought you might have use for them." Inside the box were several small, smooth stones, each one a different color, polished by river currents, perfect for grinding herbs. It was a simple gift, yet incredibly thoughtful, a practical offering that spoke directly to her solitary work, her quiet dedication. Ming reached out, her fingers tracing the smooth surfaces of the stones, a surge of emotion catching in her throat. It was another thread, silently woven into the tapestry of their growing understanding. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with gratitude. "They are beautiful." A quiet smile, rare but profoundly genuine, touched Joshua's lip. In that shared moment, surrounded by the thawing earth and the vast, silent expanse of the land, a new kind of bloom, more resilient than any spring flower, began to unfurl between them, a testament to the enduring power of human connection, forged in the quiet spaces between words and the shared understanding of a harsh yet beautiful world. The fragile peace that had settled around Ming and Joshua, nurtured by their unspoken understanding, was not destined to last undisturbed. Harmony Gulch, for all its quiet charm, was also a crucible of simmering prejudices, and the sight of the reserved rancher's subtle attentions to the Chinese widow had become a gnawing irritation for some. The catalyst for the brewing storm arrived in the form of Jedidiah Stone, a man whose wealth had been amassed through questionable land dealings and whose power was wielded with a heavy hand. Jedidiah owned a substantial portion of the grazing land bordering Joshua's ranch, and he had long eyed Joshua's prosperous acreage with covetous intent. He saw Joshua's quiet kindness towards Ming not as a virtue, but as a weakness, a chink in the armor of an otherwise formidable opponent. One sweltering summer afternoon, during the peak of the dry season, a small, carefully tended irrigation ditch that supplied water to Ming's small garden, a vital lifeline in the arid landscape, was deliberately sabotaged. The water, essential for her carefully cultivated medicinal herbs and meager vegetable patch, began to leak uselessly into the parched earth, threatening to destroy her year's meticulous work. Ming discovered the damage during her morning rounds, her heart sinking with each gaping hole in the clay-lined ditch. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was no accident. The cuts were too precise, too malicious. Her initial reaction was a familiar wave of despair, the feeling of utter helplessness against the unseen forces that seemed determined to push her out. She worked tirelessly, trying to patch the leaks with mud and stones, her hands raw and aching, but the damage was extensive, beyond her solitary repair. Word of the sabotaged ditch reached Joshua, not through direct complaint from Ming, who was too proud to ask for help, but through the hushed, knowing whispers in the general store. He rode out to her cabin, his jaw set, a thunderous look in his eyes that Ming had never seen before. He surveyed the damage, his gaze taking in her exhausted posture, the futility of her efforts, and the slow, agonizing death of her precious plants. "This wasn't nature's doing," he stated, his voice low and dangerous, a stark contrast to his usual quiet demeanor. Ming merely nodded, her eyes downcast, the shame of her vulnerability a heavy shroud. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Joshua knelt by the damaged ditch, examining the deliberate cuts. "Jedidiah," he muttered, his fists clenching. "He sees you as a way to get at me." It was a blunt, unvarnished truth, laying bare the ugly underbelly of the town's prejudice, using Ming as a pawn in a larger game of power and intimidation. For a moment, the old fear threatened to overwhelm Ming, the instinct to retreat, to shrink into herself and endure. But then she looked at Joshua, at the unwavering resolve in his eyes, at the quiet fury that burned beneath his calm exterior. She saw not pity, but a fierce, protective anger that was directed at the injustice, not at her. A new feeling stirred within her, a quiet defiance that sparked to life. "I will not leave," she said, her voice small but firm, meeting his gaze. "This is my home now." Joshua's expression softened slightly, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. He rose to his feet. "Then we fix it," he declared, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "And we make sure this doesn't happen again." It was a declaration of solidarity, a promise of shared resistance against the cruelty that sought to break her. In that moment, surrounded by the dying plants and the broken earth, Ming felt a surge of strength she hadn't known she possessed, a quiet courage born from the unwavering support of a man who saw her worth, not her difference, and a profound, life-altering sense of not being alone in her struggle. The confrontation, though silent and strategic, began the very next morning. Joshua arrived at Ming's cabin with two of his most trusted ranch hands, seasoned men whose loyalty to him was unquestioning. They brought tools, timber, and a determination that seemed to radiate from their quiet efficiency. Under Joshua's direction, they began to systematically repair the damaged irrigation ditch, working with a methodical pace that spoke of experience and resolve. Ming, initially hesitant to accept such extensive help, quickly understood that this was not charity but a declaration, a visible assertion of protection. She worked alongside them, her hands, still sore from her previous attempts, moving with renewed vigor, clearing debris, mixing mud, and carefully aligning new sections of the ditch. The physical labor was a balm, a way to channel the renewed sense of purpose that coursed through her veins. The news of Joshua's intervention spread through Harmony Gulch like wildfire, reaching Jedidiah Stone's ears even before the last section of the ditch was repaired. Jedidiah, furious at being thwarted, attempted to escalate the situation, sending veiled threats and spreading malicious rumors about Joshua's character and his unconventional alliances. He even tried to rally some of the more prejudiced townsfolk against Joshua, painting him as a man who cared more for an outsider than for the true people of Harmony Gulch. But Jedidiah had underestimated Joshua's quiet strength and the deep respect he commanded among his peers. When Joshua, with a steely glint in his eyes, confronted Jedidiah publicly outside the saloon, not with violence, but with a calm, unwavering assertion of his rights and a clear warning against further harassment of Ming, the townsfolk witnessed a different kind of power. Joshua laid out the facts, implicating Jedidiah in the sabotage without raising his voice, his quiet conviction more potent than any shouted accusation. He spoke of the importance of community, of fairness, and subtly reminded Jedidiah of the unwritten rules of the frontier, where self-reliance and mutual respect, not petty cruelty, were the true pillars of survival. The confrontation, though brief, was definitive. Jedidiah, accustomed to intimidation and bluster, found himself facing a man who would not back down, a man whose quiet resolve was unshakable. Faced with Joshua's unwavering gaze and the subtle but undeniable support of many of the onlookers, even those who harbored prejudices, Jedidiah's bravado crumbled. He retreated, his face a mask of thwarted rage, but with a silent understanding that his tactics had failed. The incident became a turning point for Harmony Gulch. While some of the deeper-seated prejudices against Ming remained, Jedidiah's defeat and Joshua's resolute stand had a profound impact. The public act of defending Ming, not out of pity but out of a clear sense of justice and a deep-seated respect, forced many to reevaluate their own assumptions. The power dynamics had shifted, quietly but irrevocably. For Ming, the most significant shift was internal. She had faced down the forces of malice and prejudice, not alone, but with the steadfast support of Joshua. The experience had forged a new kind of resilience within her, a quiet strength that emanated from a newfound sense of belonging. The carefully repaired ditch, now flowing freely with life-giving water, was more than just an irrigation system. It was a symbol of her enduring presence, her rightful place in this land, safeguarded by an unexpected ally whose quiet strength had become her shield. The summer eventually gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn, and then to the hushed, expectant silence of another approaching winter. The ditch continued to flow, a testament to Joshua's intervention and Ming's unyielding spirit. The incident with Jedidiah Stone had indeed been a turning point, etching itself into the collective memory of Harmony Gulch. While whispers still occasionally surfaced, they were no longer fueled by unbridled malice, but by a grudging respect, or perhaps a simmering discomfort with the disruption of their established order. Ming's presence in the community, once tolerated with a frosty distance, now carried a different weight. People occasionally nodded to her on the street. Some even offered a tentative smile. Mrs. Henderson, still prone to gossip, now included Ming's name in her stories not with disdain, but with a measure of cautious awe, speaking of the Chinese widow and the rancher, with a tone that bordered on fascination. She even bought a small bundle of Ming's dried herbs one afternoon, a quiet, almost imperceptible bridge of acceptance. The relationship between Ming and Joshua continued to deepen, unfolding with the slow, unhurried rhythm of the seasons. It was a connection built on shared silences, on understanding glances, and on the quiet affirmation of mutual respect. He would often ride by her cabin, pausing to observe her tending her garden or fixing a fence, sometimes dismounting to offer a hand, his large, calloused fingers working alongside her smaller, nimble ones. Their conversations remained plain-spoken, focusing on the practicalities of the land, the changing weather, the needs of their animals. But beneath the surface, a profound, unspoken language of the heart was being woven. There was no grand declaration, no sweeping romantic gesture in the conventional sense. Their love story was etched in the steady cadence of their shared existence, in the quiet acts of loyalty, and in the unwavering belief in each other's inherent goodness. It was a love born of hardship and resilience, earned through quiet dignity and steadfast support, reflecting the vast, dramatic landscape that surrounded them. One late autumn evening, as the first snowflakes began to dance in the twilight, Joshua dismounted at her cabin, his breath pluming in the cold air. Ming was stirring a pot of fragrant stew over her small hearth, the scent of ginger and wild herbs filling the cozy space. He didn't immediately speak, simply stood by the doorway, his silhouette framed by the deepening dusk. Ming turned, her eyes soft, meeting his steady gaze. The years of solitude, of unspoken pain, seemed to melt away in that moment, replaced by a quiet, profound certainty. He looked at her, truly saw her, not as the Chinese widow or the outsider, but as the woman who had faced down an unforgiving world with unwavering strength, the woman whose quiet dignity resonated with his own. "Winter's coming," he said, his voice low, a warmth in its depth that had been absent for so long. "It gets cold out here, alone." It wasn't a question, but an invitation, a gentle offering of shared warmth, shared burdens, a shared future. Ming's gaze searched his, finding not just affection, but a deep, abiding respect. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, a radiant bloom in the flickering firelight. "Yes," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet, profound hope that echoed the sentiment of his unspoken proposal. "It does." It was an acceptance, plain and honest, a culmination of two lives converging, not through spectacle, but through the quiet, enduring power of human connection, an earnest promise etched against the backdrop of an unforgiving yet beautiful frontier. The years that followed unfolded with the steady, reassuring rhythm of the seasons, each bringing its own challenges and triumphs, solidifying the quiet bond between Ming and Joshua. Their union, unconventional and born of a shared resilience, became a testament to the enduring power of human connection in the vast, often lonely expanses of the frontier. Joshua's ranch, once a solitary domain, now hummed with a different kind of warmth, Ming's presence weaving an intricate tapestry of domesticity and quiet purpose. Her small herb garden flourished near the main cabin, its vibrant greens and aromatic scents a quiet defiance against the harsh landscape, and her spiced bread became a beloved staple, its rich aroma often drifting across the homestead. She took to the rhythm of ranch life with an innate grace, her observations sharp, her hands capable, bringing a quiet efficiency to their shared existence. The early years of their life together were not without their difficulties, both from the harsh realities of the land and the lingering skepticism of some townsfolk. But Joshua's steadfast loyalty and Ming's quiet strength created an impenetrable fortress around them. He stood by her, always, in the quiet way that was his nature, defending her honor with unwavering conviction when needed, and simply being present with a steadfast resolve in all other moments. His love was a grounded, earnest thing, built on shared labor, mutual respect, and a deep understanding that transcended words. Ming, in turn, brought a gentle, nurturing spirit to his often austere world, softening the edges of his solitary existence with her quiet affection and unwavering support. Their home became a place of refuge, a sanctuary of earned safety and belonging. The community of Harmony Gulch, over time, began to shift its perspective. The initial curiosity and prejudice slowly gave way to a grudging admiration, and then, for many, a genuine respect. They saw Ming not just as the Chinese widow, but as Joshua's wife, a woman of quiet strength and remarkable skill, whose presence had brought a palpable sense of peace and prosperity to the ranch. They witnessed the unwavering devotion between them, the quiet harmony of their lives, and the subtle, positive changes that seemed to emanate from their union. Children from neighboring ranches, no longer burdened by their parents' initial prejudices, would sometimes stop by Ming's garden, fascinated by her colorful herbs and intrigued by her gentle demeanor. She would offer them small, sweet treats or a soothing herbal tea for a scraped knee, her kindness slowly chipping away at the lingering walls of difference. Their story, a slow-burn romance woven into the harsh fabric of the frontier, became a whispered legend, a testament to the idea that love and respect could truly bridge any chasm. Joshua and Ming, now older, their faces etched with the lines of a life lived fully, would often sit together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun dip below the vast horizon, painting the sky in dramatic hues of gold and violet. The silence between them was not empty, but full, rich with the memories of shared hardships and earned triumphs, of a love that had defied expectation and prejudice. Their hands would sometimes meet, his calloused, hers softer but equally capable, a simple, profound touch that spoke of a lifetime of unwavering devotion. The world outside their ranch might still hold its biases and its cruelties, but within the bounds of their shared life, they had found a quiet triumph, a lasting peace, and a profound, enduring sense of belonging that was all their own, a resilient flame against the vast, indifferent expanse of the world.